In 1885, you could walk into any pharmacy in the United States, hand over a few cents, and walk out with cocaine. No prescription, no ID, no questions. The bottle might say cocaine toothache drops or cocaine cough syrup, or simply cocaine, and it would be sitting on the shelf next to the aspirin and the cough drops and the children's medicine. This was not a black market. This was not a loophole. This was the entirely legal, entirely normal, widely advertised commercial drug market of the United States of America. For the first 138 years of the country's existence, the federal government had essentially no authority to tell you what substances you could buy, sell, or put into your body. That authority did not exist. Nobody in Washington had passed a law creating it. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 changed that. It was the first federal law in American history to regulate the sale of cocaine and opiates. It did not ban them outright. It taxed them, required registration, created paperwork, but it was the crack in the door, and through that crack came everything that followed. The Controlled Substances Act, the war on drugs, the largest prison population in the history of the world. This is the story of how America went from a country where you could buy heroin at the drugstore to a country that imprisons more of its citizens per capita than any nation on earth. It is the story of the substances themselves, of the people who sold them, of the moral panic that made regulation possible, and of the forces that turned regulation into prohibition and prohibition into mass incarceration. And it is the story of how much of what you think you know about why drugs are illegal turns out to be wrong. In 1800, the United States had no drug problem in the sense we would recognize today, largely because it had no concept of a drug problem. The word addiction did not exist in its modern sense. The substances we now consider dangerous were widely available, widely used, and widely understood to be medicine. Opium had been used for pain relief since antiquity. It was the most effective painkiller in existence, and in the early 19th century, it was essentially the only one. Laudanum, which was opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold in every general store in the country. It was prescribed for pain, for coughs, for menstrual cramps, for anxiety, for children who would not sleep. Physicians recommended it. Mothers gave it to their babies. It was so common that contemporary accounts barely mention it, the way we might not think to mention that someone took ibuprofen. Morphine, isolated from opium in 1804, became widely available in the United States during the Civil War. The Army issued it to surgeons. Soldiers were given it for battlefield wounds. It worked dramatically well, and when the war ended, hundreds of thousands of veterans came home with what contemporary physicians called the Army disease, a dependence on morphine that had no recognized treatment and no social stigma attached to it. These were men who had been wounded in service to their country. The morphine had saved their lives. Nobody blamed them for needing it. Cocaine arrived later. Isolated from the coca leaf in 1860, it became commercially available in the United States in the 1880s and was immediately embraced by the medical profession as a miracle drug. It was a local anesthetic, the first effective one ever developed, and it transformed surgery. It treated hay fever, it treated depression, it treated fatigue, it was put into patent medicines, into wines, into soft drinks. Coca-Cola, when it was first introduced in 1886, contained cocaine derived from coca leaf extract. The company removed it in 1903, but for 17 years, a glass of Coca-Cola delivered a small dose of cocaine along with its sugar and carbonation. Sigmund Freud published a paper in 1884 called Uber Coca, in which he called cocaine a magical substance and recommended it for the treatment of depression, morphine addiction, and alcohol dependence. He sent it to his fiancée as a gift. He took it himself and wrote enthusiastically about the results. This was not fringe medicine. This was the mainstream scientific consensus of the era. The problem, as physicians gradually began to understand, was that the mainstream scientific consensus of the era was wrong. Dependence on opiates was not well understood in 1870. The concept of addiction as a chronic disease, as a condition with biological mechanisms that altered the brain, simply did not exist. What physicians observed was that some patients who use morphine or laudanum for extended periods seemed to require increasing amounts to achieve the same effect, and experienced distressing symptoms when they stopped. They described this as a habit, the way someone might have a habit of drinking too much coffee. The moral framework was individual weakness. The solution, to the extent there was one, was willpower. What nobody understood yet was that opiates bind to specific receptors in the brain, that sustained use causes the brain to downregulate its own natural opioid production, and that the symptoms of withdrawal are not a character defect, but a physiological crisis produced by the sudden absence of a substance the brain has restructured itself around. That understanding was decades away. In the meantime, the American drug market of the late 19th century was enormous, profitable, almost entirely unregulated, and producing a level of dependence that contemporaries were only beginning to grasp. The patent medicine industry was at the center of it. Patent medicines were proprietary preparations sold directly to the public, often with dramatic names and extravagant claims. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed for teething children, contained morphine. Oyer's cherry pectoral, sold as a cough remedy, contained opium. Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company that invented aspirin, introduced heroin as a cough suppressant in 1898 and sold it as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. The name heroin came from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, a reference to the powerful feelings it produced. These products were sold through pharmacies, through general stores, through mail-order catalogs, through newspaper advertisements. The advertisements were not subtle. They promised relief from pain, from fatigue, from nervousness, from the general difficulty of being alive, and they delivered on the promise, at least in the short term, which is why people kept buying them. The federal government had almost no authority to regulate any of this. The Constitution, as it was then understood, gave Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, but the regulation of medicine and public health was considered a state matter. A few states had passed laws requiring pharmacists to label products containing opiates or cocaine, but these laws were inconsistently enforced and easily circumvented. The national market was effectively ungoverned. That began to change in 1906 when Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. The act was pushed through largely by Harvey Washington Wiley, the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture, who had spent years documenting the fraudulent and sometimes dangerous claims made by patent medicine manufacturers. Wiley was not primarily concerned with addiction. He was concerned with poison, with manufacturers who put formaldehyde in milk and borax in butter and toxic dyes in candy. He wanted honest labeling. He wanted the government to have the authority to remove genuinely dangerous products from the market. The Pure Food and Drug Act required manufacturers to list on the label any product that contained alcohol, opiates, cocaine, cannabis, chloroform, or several other specified substances. It did not prohibit these substances. It required disclosure. If your cough syrup contained morphine, the label had to say so. This sounds modest. In context, it was significant. For the first time, the federal government had asserted the authority to regulate what was in a commercial product and require honest representation to consumers. The principle that the government could intervene in the drug market had been established, even if the intervention itself was limited. What was coming next was not limited at all. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 was introduced by Representative Francis Burton Harrison of New York. It was presented as a revenue measure, a tax on the manufacture and distribution of opiates and cocaine, with a registration requirement for everyone in the supply chain from importer to prescribing physician. On its face, it was not a prohibition. Physicians could still prescribe opiates and cocaine. Pharmacists could still dispense them. The tax was 1 cent per ounce, essentially nominal. But the act contained something that would reshape American drug policy for the next century. It required that all prescriptions for opiates and cocaine be written in the course of professional practice. That phrase became the central battleground of American drug law for the next decade. What did it mean to prescribe opiates in the course of professional practice? Did it mean that a physician could prescribe morphine to a patient who was dependent on it, to prevent the agonizing symptoms of withdrawal? Or did maintaining a dependent patient on their drug of dependence constitute not professional practice, but criminal drug dealing? The Treasury Department, which was responsible for enforcing the Harrison Act, took the latter position. Between 1915 and 1925, Treasury agents arrested thousands of physicians for prescribing opiates to dependent patients. The American Medical Association, which had initially supported Harrison as a reasonable regulatory measure, found itself defending its members against federal prosecution for the act of treating patients. The Supreme Court weighed in multiple times. In Webb v. United States in 1919, the court ruled that prescribing opiates to an addict simply to keep the addict comfortable was not a legitimate medical prescription and therefore violated the Harrison Act. In United States v. Berman in 1922, the court went further, ruling that a physician who prescribed opiates to an addict in large quantities violated the act even if the intent was to cure the addiction. These rulings effectively ended the medical treatment of addiction in the United States. Physicians who attempted to maintain dependent patients on their drugs were prosecuted. Clinics that had been established in several cities to provide morphine to dependent people were shut down. The roughly 200,000 Americans who were dependent on opiates in 1914, a conservative estimate, were suddenly cut off from their legal supply. Where did they go? They went to the black market. And the black market, as it always does when legal supply is removed, expanded rapidly to meet the demand. This is the pattern that would repeat itself throughout the 20th century. and it was visible from the very beginning. When legal supply was cut off, the price of the substance rose, the quality became unpredictable, the risk of overdose increased, and the people most affected were the most vulnerable, those with the fewest resources to navigate a dangerous illegal market. The people who designed the Harrison Act were not primarily motivated by concern for opiate-dependent Americans. They were motivated by a set of concerns that had much more to do with race than with pharmacology. The anti-cocaine movement of the early 20th century was driven in significant part by explicitly racial hysteria. In the South, newspapers and politicians had been publishing stories for years claiming that cocaine made black men violent, immune to pain, capable of superhuman feats of strength, and sexually dangerous to white women. These stories had essentially no factual basis. They were fabrications, deliberate or credulous, that served the political purpose of justifying violence against black communities and the legal purpose of justifying restriction on a substance that was being blamed for that violence. Hamilton Wright, the State Department official who was the primary architect of American drug policy in the early 20th century, testified before Congress in 1910 that cocaine was the direct incentive to the crime of rape by the Negroes of the South. He presented no evidence. He cited newspaper accounts. Congress listened carefully. The anti-opium movement had a parallel racial dimension, directed this time at Chinese immigrants. Opium smoking had been associated with Chinese communities in California since the Gold Rush era, when Chinese laborers had brought the practice with them. By the 1870s and 1880s, opium dens in cities like San Francisco had become the focus of moral panic, characterized in the press as places where innocent white women were lured and corrupted by Chinese men. The actual evidence for this characterization was, again, essentially non-existent. Opium use was widespread among white Americans, who consumed it in the form of laudanum and patent medicines in enormous quantities. But the racial framing served a political purpose in an era when anti-Chinese sentiment was already driving the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Opium smoking was banned in city after city, with laws that applied explicitly to smoking opium, the method used predominantly by Chinese immigrants, while leaving oral consumption of opium, the method used predominantly by white Americans, unregulated. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. The substances that were targeted for restriction in the early 20th century were targeted not primarily because of their pharmacological properties, but because of their association with communities that the political majority wanted to control, exclude, or criminalize. Cannabis provides the clearest example of how this worked. Marijuana, as it was increasingly called in the 1930s, using the Spanish term that emphasized its association with Mexican immigrants, had been used medically for decades under its pharmaceutical name cannabis. It was in the United States pharmacopoeia. Physicians prescribed it for pain, for nausea, for muscle spasms. It was not a controlled substance. It was not a significant public concern. Then Harry Anslinger became the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, and everything changed. Anslinger was a bureaucrat who needed a mission. The Harrison Act had given the Treasury Department authority over opiates and cocaine, but the bureau he inherited was small, underfunded, and looking for a reason to expand. Cannabis was not covered by the Harrison Act. It was a state matter, and only a handful of states had restricted it. Anslinger began a campaign to federalize cannabis prohibition that relied almost entirely on racial fear and fabricated horror stories. He told Congress and the press that marijuana caused insanity and violence, that it was primarily used by Mexicans and Negroes, that it was a direct cause of crime and sexual depravity. He collected newspaper clippings about crimes allegedly committed by marijuana users and presented them as evidence of a national crisis. The American Medical Association opposed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which Anslinger's bureau had drafted. Dr. William Woodward, the AMA's legislative counsel, testified before Congress that the organization had heard nothing to justify the classification of marijuana as a dangerous drug, that the evidence presented was entirely anecdotal, and that the act would interfere with legitimate medical use of cannabis. Woodward was dismissed by the committee chairman, who told him the AMA had been uncooperative with law enforcement and that Congress was not interested in its objections. The Marijuana Tax Act passed. It used the same mechanism as the Harrison Act, a nominally regulatory tax with registration requirements, to effectively prohibit cannabis. Anslinger enforced it aggressively, with a particular focus on black jazz musicians, who he believed were using marijuana to corrupt white youth through their music. He maintained files on jazz and swing musicians, and when the opportunity arose, he prosecuted them. Billie Holiday was his most famous target. Holiday had been struggling with heroin addiction for years when Anslinger's agents began following her. She was arrested in 1947, convicted of narcotics possession, and sent to a federal rehabilitation facility for a year. She emerged with her cabaret card revoked, meaning she could not perform in New York venues that served alcohol, which was effectively every major venue in the city. She was arrested again in 1959, in the hospital where she was dying of liver failure. Federal agents showed up at her deathbed and placed her under arrest. She died under guard. This is where drug enforcement was by the late 1950s. Not a public health intervention. Not a system for getting dependent people into treatment. A punitive apparatus aimed with particular force at Black Americans and other marginalized communities, enforced by a bureau that had developed institutional habits of targeting based on race, music taste, and political associations. The counterculture of the 1960s created a new crisis for this apparatus. White college students, the children of the middle class, were using marijuana and LSD and other substances in highly visible ways. The enforcement model that had worked when drug use was associated with communities that the majority population was comfortable targeting became politically complicated when it was being applied to the children of voters. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, was supposed to rationalize this mess. It created 5 schedules of controlled substances, ranked by medical utility and potential for abuse. Schedule 1 was the highest restriction category, substances with high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Heroin was Schedule 1. LSD was Schedule 1. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1 as a temporary measure while a commission studied the question. The Schaefer Commission, as it was known, delivered its report in 1972. It recommended decriminalizing marijuana possession for personal use. It found that marijuana was not physically addictive, that it did not lead to harder drug use, and that criminal prosecution of marijuana users was causing more harm than the drug itself. Nixon rejected the report before it was finished. He had already decided what the answer was going to be. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, gave an interview in 2016, published after his death, that has become one of the most widely cited pieces of evidence about the true motivations of the war on drugs. Ehrlichman told journalist Dan Baum that the Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. That is a Nixon administration official describing in explicit terms the use of drug law as a tool of political and racial suppression. It was not an accident. It was a strategy. The consequences of that strategy are still being counted. The United States currently incarcerates approximately 2.1 million people, the largest prison population in the world by absolute number and one of the largest per capita. Drug offenses account for roughly 1 in 5 of those incarcerations. Black Americans are incarcerated for drug offenses at nearly 6 times the rate of white Americans, despite roughly similar rates of drug use across racial groups. The crack cocaine sentencing disparity, established by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, required the same mandatory minimum prison sentence for possession of 1 gram of crack cocaine as for 100 grams of powder cocaine. Crack was used predominantly in black communities. Powder cocaine was used predominantly in white communities. The disparity was not based on pharmacology. The 2 forms of cocaine are the same drug with the same effects. The disparity was based on race, dressed up as public safety policy. That disparity was partially reduced by the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, which changed the ratio from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. It was not eliminated. The disparity still exists. We are now in what many people call the 3rd era of American drug policy. The first era was the unregulated market of the 19th century. The second era was the prohibition and criminalization model that ran from 1914 through the present. The third era is something still taking shape, defined by the legalization or decriminalization of marijuana in more than half of American states, by the recognition that the opioid epidemic of the 21st century, which has killed more than 500,000 Americans since 1999, cannot be solved through law enforcement, and by a slow, grudging, incomplete reckoning with the racial history of drug prohibition. The opioid epidemic is particularly instructive. Beginning in the late 1990s, pharmaceutical companies led by Purdue Pharma aggressively marketed OxyContin, a time-released opioid, to physicians across the country. They claimed, falsely, that the time-release formulation made it difficult to abuse. They paid physicians to speak at conferences about opioid pain management. They flooded rural communities, particularly in Appalachia and the rural Midwest, with prescription opioids. The result was an epidemic of addiction that spread from prescription pills to heroin to fentanyl, and that has, as of 2025, killed more Americans than the entire Vietnam War. The government's response to the opioid epidemic, which hit white communities with particular severity, was markedly different from its response to the crack epidemic of the 1980s, which hit black communities. Opioid users were described in the press as victims of a public health crisis. Crack users had been described as criminals. Congress passed funding for treatment and recovery. The architects of the crack epidemic had funded more prisons and longer sentences. This is not to say that the opioid response has been adequate. It has not been. But the contrast in framing is stark, and it illuminates something important about the history we have been tracing. Drug policy in America has never been primarily about pharmacology. It has been about politics, about which communities are to be protected and which are to be controlled, about which forms of intoxication are acceptable and which are criminal, about who gets to be a victim and who gets to be a criminal. Those decisions were made at specific moments by specific people for specific reasons. The Harrison Act was shaped by racial hysteria. The Marijuana Tax Act was pushed by a bureaucrat seeking institutional relevance. The crack sentencing disparity was a deliberate political strategy. The opioid epidemic was produced by a pharmaceutical company that paid billions in fines and whose executives faced minimal personal consequences. None of this was inevitable. A country that had sold cocaine at the pharmacy for 30 years did not have to end up with the largest prison population in the world. The path from there to here was chosen, step by step, decision, by people who had other options available to them. The question of what comes next is genuinely open. More than half of American states have now legalized recreational marijuana, a substance that was in Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act, classified as having no medical use and high abuse potential for over 50 years. The federal government has not rescheduled it. People are still in federal prison for marijuana offenses committed under the old law. Oregon became the first state to decriminalize possession of all drugs in 2020. Treating possession as a civil infraction rather than a criminal offense and directing people toward treatment rather than incarceration. The results were mixed enough that Oregon reversed course in 2024, recriminalizing possession. The debate about what decriminalization actually requires to work, particularly in terms of treatment infrastructure, continues. The fentanyl crisis has changed the landscape in ways that make simple policy answers impossible. Fentanyl is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine. A lethal dose is measured in micrograms, an amount invisible to the naked eye. It has infiltrated the illicit drug supply to such a degree that people who believe they are buying heroin or cocaine or counterfeit prescription pills are frequently buying fentanyl. The overdose death rate has reached levels that were unimaginable a decade ago. There is no enforcement solution to this problem. You cannot arrest your way out of a crisis in which the lethal dose of the substance is smaller than a grain of salt, and the supply chain runs from Mexican cartels through a distribution network that touches every corner of the country. The people dying are not primarily the dealers. They are the users, who are themselves victims of a market they have no power over. What would actually work is a question that public health experts, law enforcement officials, politicians, and advocates have been arguing about for years. The evidence from countries that have taken different approaches — Portugal decriminalized all drug possession in 2001 and invested in treatment and social support. Switzerland provides pharmaceutical heroin to chronic users who have not responded to other treatments. Canada has opened supervised consumption sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision. Suggests that the criminalization model produces worse outcomes on almost every metric than harm reduction approaches. But the United States has not arrived at a consensus on that conclusion. The politics of drug policy remain volatile. The racial inequities built into enforcement remain deeply embedded. The pharmaceutical industry that produced the opioid epidemic has paid fines and moved on. And the basic framework established by the Harrison Act in 1914, the idea that the federal government has the authority to determine which substances are permissible and which are criminal, and that criminal law is the primary tool for enforcing those determinations, remains in place. 110 years after a man could walk into a pharmacy and buy cocaine over the counter, the country is still trying to figure out what it actually believes about drugs, about addiction, about punishment, and about who deserves help and who deserves a prison cell. The answer it comes up with will say a great deal about what kind of country it has decided to be. That is where we are in 2025. Not at the end of the story. Somewhere in the middle of it, still working out what the beginning actually meant. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. There is a great deal more of it left to tell. To understand where we are, you need to understand what happened in the years between 1914 and 1970 more carefully than the textbook version allows. Because the story that is usually told, that the government looked at dangerous drugs and rationally decided to restrict them for the public good, is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is something considerably more complicated and considerably more troubling. After the Harrison Act, the immediate effect on the American drug market was not a reduction in use. It was a reorganization of supply. People who had been buying opiates legally from pharmacists, with their names attached to the transaction, were now buying them from a black market that had no accountability, no quality control, and no interest in the well-being of the customer. The price went up, the quality went down, the risk went up. The number of people who died from contaminated or misdosed opiates went up. This outcome was predictable. Several physicians and public health officials predicted it at the time. They were ignored because the political consensus behind the Harrison Act was not primarily about public health. It was about moral regulation. The belief, widespread in the progressive era, that certain substances were inherently corrupting, that the people who used them were morally weakened, and that the law had not just the right but the obligation to protect people from their own choices. This is the paternalism at the heart of American drug prohibition, and it has never really gone away. The debate about drug policy in 2025 still contains the ghost of it, in the assumption that people who use drugs are making a choice that the law has the right to override. The question of whether that assumption is correct, whether the law has that right, and whether exercising it produces better outcomes than not exercising it, is the central question that a century of drug prohibition has not resolved. What prohibition did produce, with remarkable consistency, was a set of unintended consequences that are by now so well documented that they have their own name in economics. The iron law of prohibition, formulated by researcher Richard Cowan in 1986, states that the more intense the law enforcement, the more potent the prohibited substance becomes. The logic is straightforward. When you are taking the risk of arrest to sell a drug, you want to sell the most value in the smallest possible package. Low-potency substances give way to high-potency ones. Opium gives way to morphine, gives way to heroin, gives way to fentanyl. Beer gives way to spirits during alcohol prohibition. The enforcement creates the potency problem it is trying to solve. Alcohol prohibition makes the comparison unavoidable. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919, prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. It was the product of the same progressive-era reformist energy that produced the Harrison Act, driven by many of the same people and many of the same moral arguments. It lasted 14 years. It was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, in a rare moment of the country admitting that it had made a significant error. The effects of alcohol prohibition are well documented. Alcohol use did decline initially, particularly among working-class men who had been the heaviest consumers. But the black market for alcohol grew rapidly and was controlled by organized crime syndicates that built enormous wealth and institutional power during the Prohibition years. Al Capone's organization in Chicago was earning an estimated $60 million a year from bootlegging alone by 1927. The violence associated with controlling that market was spectacular and public and created exactly the kind of social disorder that Prohibition had been supposed to prevent. When Prohibition ended, the organized crime networks that had built themselves around bootlegging needed new revenue streams. Some of them turned to narcotics. The infrastructure of illegal distribution, the relationships, the corruption of law enforcement, the networks for moving product and laundering money, transferred smoothly from alcohol to other drugs. Prohibition had not reduced crime. It had professionalized it. The lesson was not learned. Or rather, the lesson was observed and then set aside, because the political case for drug prohibition was not primarily empirical. It was moral and racial, and those arguments did not respond to evidence about outcomes the way economic arguments do. What changed in the 1960s was the political coalition. Marijuana use spread from black jazz musicians and Mexican agricultural workers, the communities Anslinger had originally targeted, to white college students and young professionals. This created a political problem. You could not easily apply to children of the middle class the same enforcement apparatus that had been built to target black and brown communities, without producing the kind of backlash that threatened political consequences. Nixon's solution was brilliant in its cynicism. He did not ease enforcement. He escalated it. He declared a war on drugs, dramatically expanded federal drug enforcement, and used the drug war as a political weapon against his enemies, exactly as Ehrlichman described. The genius of it was that the enforcement, while theoretically race-neutral, was applied in practice with the same racial targeting that had always characterized drug enforcement, while the rhetoric was universally moralistic, framed in terms of protecting all Americans from a national scourge. Ronald Reagan intensified the war on drugs in the 1980s. The crack cocaine epidemic, which hit black urban communities with devastating force beginning in the mid-1980s, produced a political panic that led to the mandatory minimum sentencing laws that filled the federal prison system with low-level drug offenders. The people who went to prison were not the Medellin cartel. They were the people at the bottom of the distribution chain, the street-level dealers who were the most visible and the most vulnerable. The kingpins, who had the resources to hire lawyers and who operated at enough remove from the street to avoid easy prosecution, were largely unaffected. The prison population of the United States in 1980 was approximately 500,000. By 2008, it had risen to 2.3 million. Drug offenses were a primary driver of that increase. The United States became, by a significant margin, the most incarcerated country in the developed world. This was not a crime reduction strategy. Study after study showed that the marginal deterrent effect of incarceration on drug offenses is minimal, because the people making the decision to sell drugs are not calculating prison sentences. They are making economic decisions based on the alternatives available to them in communities where legal economic opportunities are scarce. This brings us to the economic dimension of the drug war that rarely gets enough attention. The illegal drug market in the United States is, by any measure, a massive economic enterprise. Estimates of its size vary, but most serious analyses put the retail value of illegal drug sales in the United States at somewhere between $100 and $150 billion annually. That is a significant economy, comparable in size to the legal pharmaceutical industry. That economy operates in communities where legal economic alternatives are limited. The incarceration of drug offenders does not eliminate the market. It does not reduce demand. It removes people from communities temporarily and returns them with a criminal record that makes legal employment harder to find, which makes the illegal market more attractive, which increases the likelihood of reincarceration. The system is self-reinforcing in ways that have nothing to do with public health and everything to do with the political economy of law enforcement, prisons, and the communities that are most targeted by both. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, the methamphetamine epidemic of the 1990s and 2000s, the prescription opioid epidemic of the 2000s, the fentanyl crisis of the 2010s and 2020s, each of these represents a new manifestation of the same underlying dynamic. A substance becomes widely available in communities with high rates of poverty, unemployment, trauma, and social disruption. The substance provides short-term relief from conditions that are genuinely difficult. Dependence develops. The supply chain becomes more dangerous as enforcement drives it underground and toward higher potency. People die. The enforcement response has been the same each time. More police, more prosecutors, more prisons. The public health response has been late, underfunded, and politically contested. The structural conditions that make communities vulnerable to drug epidemics in the first place, poverty, lack of economic opportunity, inadequate mental health care, the consequences of previous enforcement actions that removed parents and community members and left behind criminal records that foreclosed legal futures, have been addressed minimally, if at all. What would it look like to actually learn from this history? Portugal provides one data point. In 2001, facing a heroin epidemic that was killing hundreds of people a year and driving an HIV crisis, Portugal decriminalized the personal possession of all drugs. Not legalization. Decriminalization. Possession remained illegal, but it was reclassified as a public health matter rather than a criminal one. People found with drugs were referred to dissuasion commissions staffed by social workers, lawyers, and mental health professionals. They were assessed, offered treatment, and connected with social services. Only repeat offenders who refused treatment faced any kind of sanction. The results, measured over 20 years, have been widely cited. Drug-related deaths fell sharply. HIV infections among drug users fell sharply. Drug use rates did not increase significantly. The prison population fell. The social stigma attached to drug use changed in ways that made it easier for people to seek help. Portugal is not the United States. Its drug epidemic was different in scale. Its social infrastructure is different. Its legal system is different. The lesson does not transfer directly. But the basic insight that treating drug dependence as a public health problem rather than a criminal one produces better outcomes than treating it as a law enforcement problem is not uniquely Portuguese. It is supported by evidence from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from Canada, from the United Kingdom, from every jurisdiction that has seriously tried it. The United States has not seriously tried it at the federal level. It has moved incrementally toward harm reduction in some areas, expanded access to naloxone to reverse opioid overdoses, allowed some supervised consumption sites in limited jurisdictions, increased funding for treatment. These are meaningful steps. They are not the fundamental rethinking that the evidence suggests is needed. The reason is politics. The moral framework of drug prohibition is deeply embedded in American culture and in American politics. The idea that drug use is a choice, that it reflects a character failure, and that the appropriate response to character failure is punishment, is not a position held only by cynical politicians. It is a genuine belief held by a significant portion of the American public. Changing it requires changing minds, not just laws, and changing minds about something that's deeply entangled with questions of race, class, morality, and fear is slow work. But it is happening. The marijuana legalization movement, which would have seemed politically impossible 30 years ago, has succeeded in more than half the states. The framing of the opioid epidemic, which is slowly, imperfectly being applied to other drug epidemics as well, treats addiction as a disease rather than a crime. The disclosure by Ehrlichman of the Nixon administration's cynical racial motivation has contributed to a more honest public conversation about who the drug war was actually targeting and why. The question of what comes next in American drug policy is genuinely open in a way it has not been since 1914. The framework that Harrison built, that Anslinger extended, that Nixon declared a war under, and that has produced the world's largest prison population, is being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. Legalization advocates, public health researchers, racial justice advocates, and even some law enforcement officials are pushing in the same direction, toward a system that prioritizes treatment over punishment, and that honestly confronts the racial history of how punishment has been applied. Whether that challenge succeeds, and on what timeline, will be determined by politics, by economics, and by the willingness of the country to look honestly at what the last 110 years have actually produced. We started this story with a man buying cocaine at a pharmacy in 1885. We end it with 2.1 million people in American prisons, an ongoing fentanyl crisis killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, and a country that has spent more than $1 trillion on drug enforcement since Nixon declared his war, with results that are, by almost any measure, deeply disappointing. Something went wrong between there and here. Not just the choices made at specific moments, though those choices were real and consequential. Something went wrong in the framework, in the assumption that criminal law was the right tool for this problem, that punishment was the right response to this particular kind of human suffering. What comes next depends on whether enough people are willing to say so plainly. That is the history. That is where it stands. And wherever you land on the policy questions, the history itself deserves to be understood honestly, because you cannot fix what you will not look at. If this kind of history is what brought you here, subscribe. There is more of it ahead. There is one more part of this story that rarely gets told in the same breath as the rest, and it matters for understanding where we are today. It is the story of how the pharmaceutical industry fits into all of this. Because the opioid epidemic did not appear out of nowhere. It was manufactured, in the most literal sense of the word, by a set of corporate decisions that were made with full knowledge of what they would produce. Purdue Pharma, the Connecticut-based company owned by the Sackler family, introduced OxyContin in 1996. OxyContin was a time-released version of oxycodone, an opioid that had been used medically for decades. The time-release formulation was supposed to provide sustained pain relief over 12 hours, which would make it both more effective and, Purdue claimed, less prone to abuse. Purdue's claim about abuse potential was fraudulent. The company knew, from its own research, that OxyContin could be easily abused by crushing the tablets to defeat the time-release mechanism, producing an immediate high comparable to heroin. It marketed the drug anyway, telling physicians it was safer than existing opioids, paying doctors as speakers and consultants to promote its use, and flooding the country with a sales force that was compensated based on the number of prescriptions written. The result was predictable. Prescription opioid use skyrocketed. Addiction followed. When physicians were eventually pressured to reduce opioid prescribing, patients who had become dependent on prescription opioids turned to heroin, which was cheaper and increasingly available. When the heroin supply began to be cut with fentanyl, which was cheaper to produce and dramatically more potent, overdose deaths multiplied. More than 500,000 Americans died of opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2019. The majority of those deaths traced directly to the flood of prescription opioids that Purdue Pharma and other pharmaceutical companies introduced into the American market in the late 1990s. The legal consequences for the people responsible were, to put it plainly, minimal. Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy and agreed to pay approximately $6 billion in settlements with state and federal governments. Members of the Sackler family were granted civil immunity from further lawsuits in the original bankruptcy settlement, a provision that was later struck down by the Supreme Court and sent back for renegotiation. As of 2025, no Sackler family member has served prison time for their role in the opioid epidemic. The executives of Purdue Pharma who managed the fraudulent marketing campaign paid modest fines. 3 pleaded guilty to felony charges and served no prison time. Compare this to the hundreds of thousands of people currently in American prisons for drug offenses. Many of them are there for selling the very drugs that Purdue's marketing flood created the demand for. The people who created the supply, who corrupted the medical system, who lobbied against opioid restrictions, who suppressed internal research showing their product was dangerous, those people are largely free. This disparity is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of a system that has always applied its harshest enforcement at the bottom of the supply chain, to the people with the least political and economic power, while treating the people at the top, who have lawyers, who make campaign contributions, who sit on hospital boards and university advisory committees, with a fundamentally different standard. The opioid epidemic has produced the most public reckoning with this disparity since the civil rights movement challenged the crack cocaine sentencing disparities of the 1980s. Whether that reckoning produces lasting change, whether the system that has been in place since Harrison in 1914 is actually reformed in fundamental ways, or whether the political will dissipates as the crisis fades from the front pages, remains to be seen. What does not remain to be seen is the history. The history is documented in court records and congressional testimony and corporate documents that have been produced in litigation and in the archives of a century of drug enforcement. It is a history that does not support the story that drug prohibition in America was primarily about protecting public health. It is a history that shows, clearly and consistently, that the decisions about which substances to prohibit, how to enforce that prohibition, and who to target with enforcement were driven by race, by politics, by bureaucratic self-interest, and by corporate greed as much as by any genuine concern for the well-being of the people affected. That does not mean that drugs are not dangerous. They are. Opioid dependence is a devastating condition. Cocaine addiction destroys lives. Fentanyl kills with a speed and efficiency that is genuinely terrifying. The harms are real, and any honest accounting of the history has to include them, but the harms produced by the substances are not the only harms in this story. The harms produced by prohibition, by the criminalization of dependence, by the racial targeting of enforcement, by the pharmaceutical industry's manipulation of the medical system, by the political use of drug policy as a tool of social control, those harms are also real, and they are also part of the history. The person who walked into a pharmacy in 1885 and bought cocaine was living in a country that had not yet made the choices that produced the world we live in now. Those choices were made by real people, in real moments, for real reasons. Understanding those reasons is not the same as excusing them. It is the first step toward making different ones. That is the story of American drug law. From the pharmacy shelf in 1885 to the federal prison system in 2025. 140 years of choices, each one building on the last, each one making the next one harder to reverse. Whether the next 140 years look different depends on whether enough people are willing to understand what the first 140 actually were. Subscribe if you want to keep following this kind of history. The next story is already waiting. Let us go back to the beginning one more time, because the beginning contains something that gets lost when we move too quickly to the moral and political arguments. In 1885, the person buying cocaine at the pharmacy was not necessarily doing anything unusual. They might have been a middle-aged woman picking up her monthly supply of Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, which contained alcohol but was marketed heavily to women who would have been embarrassed to be seen buying liquor. They might have been a laborer with a bad tooth, picking up cocaine toothache drops because the dentist cost more than the drops did. They might have been a Civil War veteran managing the pain from a wound that had never properly healed, buying laudanum the way his physician had been recommending for 20 years. None of these people thought of themselves as drug users in any stigmatized sense. They were managing pain or fatigue or the ordinary difficulties of lives that were physically harder than most lives are today. The substances they were using were legal, were socially accepted, were sold by reputable businesses, and were recommended by the medical profession. The transformation of those substances from medicine into crime, and of those people from patients into criminals, happened through a set of decisions made over the following 3 decades that had much more to do with who was using which substances than with the pharmacological properties of the substances themselves. Opium was fine when it was in a middle-class woman's laudanum bottle. It was a crime when it was being smoked in a Chinese immigrant's pipe. Cocaine was fine when it was in a Georgia pharmacist's patent medicine. It was a threat to public order when it was being attributed, falsely, to black men in Southern newspapers. The people who made those distinctions were not acting in good faith on neutral public health grounds. They were acting on racial fear, on moral panic, on bureaucratic self-interest, and on political calculation. The evidence for this is not speculative. It is in the congressional testimony of the people who wrote the laws, in the writings of the people who enforced them, in the records of how enforcement was actually applied in the decades that followed. This matters because the legacy of those decisions is still being lived by real people. The man who is in federal prison for a drug offense that would not be illegal under the law of 23 states is living the legacy of Harry Anslinger's racial targeting. The family that lost someone to a fentanyl overdose is living the legacy of Purdue Pharma's fraudulent marketing and the enforcement system that drove opioid users from prescription drugs to the black market. The community that has been stripped of economic life by decades of incarceration of its young men is living the legacy of the 1986 mandatory minimum sentences. These are not ancient history. They are ongoing consequences of ongoing policy choices. And understanding where those choices came from is essential to making different ones. The question of what American drug policy should look like in the coming decades is genuinely contested. There are serious people who believe that stricter enforcement is part of the answer to the fentanyl crisis, that the Mexican cartels producing and distributing fentanyl need to be confronted with serious military and law enforcement pressure. There are serious people who believe that full legalization and regulation of most currently prohibited substances would produce better outcomes than the current system. There are serious people everywhere in between. What is not seriously contested, by anyone who has looked honestly at the evidence, is that the system currently in place, the one built on the Harrison Act and extended by a century of increasingly punitive drug legislation, has not produced the outcomes it promised. Drug use has not been eliminated. Drug-related deaths are at record highs. The prison population has grown to a scale that represents a genuine humanitarian crisis. The racial disparities in enforcement have never been meaningfully addressed. The pharmaceutical industry has demonstrated that it can profit from creating drug epidemics and face minimal legal consequences. That is the honest accounting of what a century of drug prohibition has produced. It is not a complete accounting, because the counterfactual, what would have happened without prohibition, is genuinely unknowable. It is possible that without any regulation, drug use and drug harm would be even worse than they are now. It is possible that the harms of prohibition are an acceptable price for the harms they prevent. These are legitimate arguments, and the people who make them deserve honest engagement rather than dismissal. But the engagement has to start from an honest account of the history. Not the sanitized version in which drug prohibition was a rational public health response to a genuine crisis, but the actual version in which racial fear, bureaucratic politics, and corporate greed played central roles in shaping what got prohibited, how enforcement was applied, and who paid the price. You cannot have an honest conversation about where to go from here until you are willing to be honest about how you got here. That is what this story has tried to be. An honest account of how a country went from selling cocaine at the pharmacy to incarcerating 2.1 million people, and what the actual reasons for that journey were. The path forward is not in this video. It is in the decisions that lawmakers, public health officials, communities, and individual voters will make in the years ahead, informed, we can hope, by a clearer understanding of the decisions that brought us to where we are. From the pharmacy shelf to the prison cell, 140 years, and still counting. If you want to keep following this kind of history, subscribe. There is a great deal more left to understand. There is a coda to this history that belongs at the end, because it is happening right now and it connects everything that came before to the present moment in a way that is impossible to ignore. As of 2025, marijuana is legal for recreational use in 24 states and the District of Columbia. It remains a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law, classified alongside heroin as having no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This creates a situation of profound legal incoherence. A person can walk into a legal dispensary in Colorado, buy cannabis products, drive home, and be in full compliance with state law. If that same person crosses into a neighboring state where cannabis remains illegal, or if they are on federal land, or if they work in an industry regulated by the federal government, they are a criminal. People are still in federal prison for marijuana offenses committed in states that have since legalized marijuana. The substance they were imprisoned for selling is now sold legally in storefronts, taxed by state governments, and advertised on billboards. The people who own those storefronts are mostly white and mostly wealthy, because the startup capital required to enter the legal cannabis industry is significant, and because the banking system, which operates under federal law, has been reluctant to work with cannabis businesses, making it harder for people without substantial personal wealth to participate. Meanwhile, the communities that bore the brunt of marijuana enforcement during the decades of prohibition, Black and Latino neighborhoods that were targeted at dramatically higher rates than white neighborhoods despite similar rates of use, have received minimal benefit from legalization. The criminal records accumulated during those decades for offenses that are no longer crimes continue to affect employment, housing, and voting rights. Expungement programs, which would clear those records, exist in some states but are inconsistently implemented and often require the person with the record to navigate a legal process that is itself a barrier. This is, in compressed form, the entire history of American drug policy in a single current example. The legal framework changes. The communities that were most harmed by the old framework are left with the residue of it. The new legal market is structured in ways that benefit those with existing capital and connections. And the political will to address the disparities directly, to provide restitution to communities that were targeted under the old law, remains insufficient to actually do it. The lesson is not that legalization is wrong. The lesson is that legalization alone is not enough. Ending the criminalization of a substance does not automatically undo the decades of harm that criminalization caused. That undoing requires active effort, sustained political will, and an honest acknowledgement of what was done and why. That acknowledgement has not yet happened at the scale the history demands. It may yet happen. The conversation is more honest now than it has been at any previous point in the century since Harrison. But the gap between the honesty of the conversation and the adequacy of the policy response remains very large. That gap is where the next chapter of this story will be written, by legislators, by courts, by communities, and by individual people making individual choices about how to engage with a policy system that has been shaped by a history most of them were never taught. You have now been taught a version of it. What you do with it is up to you.